So we filled in some new properties for a rhombus on our family tree. So make sure you have your family tree out. We know 3 things about a rhombus. Well, extra things on top of being a parallelogram. We know it's got all sides congruent, and I've already marked that. We know that the diagonals are perpendicular. That's true about a rhombus. You need to get used to these. Yes, you can use your family tree on today's quiz, but not on our next one, okay? Perpendicular. I like how you put 2 R's. Okay, diagonals are perpendicular. And then the last thing that's true about a rhombus that doesn't happen in the other 2 is that the diagonals bisect the angles. So the diagonals bisect the angles. Bisect, bisect, and then double arc, double arc, double arc, double arc. So that happens in a rhombus only. Well, a rhombus in a square. Everything happens in a square. But in a rectangle, the diagonals don't cut the angles in half. And they're not perpendicular. So these are unique to rhombus. All right, you should have found all the missing angles. We already know what Z is, so let's not even entertain that one. Quan, can you tell us what X is? And Austin, can you tell us what Y is? Let's talk about these missing angles. So Z, we totally all agree that angle Z is 90 because the diagonals are perpendicular. And then how a rhombus works is after you have the 90 degrees, there's only 2 angles left. Only 2 different numbers left. So we've got 53, 53, 53, 53. And then how are we going to find what these angles are? We've got a couple of different options. You can say consecutive angles or supplementary. You can go at it that way. Or you can look at it with this right triangle right here. You can look at it like that. And in that right triangle, you've got 90, you've got 53, and you've got missing. So that's really easy to find the missing angle that way if you want to do it that way. 37. Yep. So 37, 37, 37, 37. So for those who were absent yesterday, let's go over the 5 bonus properties that we talked about yesterday. In a rectangle, we've got 4 right angles. And we've got diagonals that are the exact same length. So I want you to think about when a shape is standing up straight, their diagonals are congruent. And when a shape is leaning over, their diagonals are not congruent. So in a parallelogram and a rhombus, the diagonals are not congruent. But in a rectangle and a square, they have good posture. They're standing up straight, so their diagonals are congruent. Congruent diagonals, not congruent diagonals. Congruent diagonals, not congruent diagonals. Okay, then we got a rhombus. By definition, a rhombus has 4 congruent sides. Or you can say all sides congruent. And the second property in a rhombus, you can do these in any order, but the diagonals bisect the angles. I think that was number 3, but it doesn't matter. And the diagonals are perpendicular. Every single property is really important, and when you're solving a problem, you're going to use all of those properties. So if you were absent yesterday, I consider you caught up, right? You're totally caught up now. Okay, so let's go over this. You mean go back one? So if we look at this, let's see if we can tell if it's a parallelogram, it can go 2 routes. It can go the rectangle route or it can go the rhombus route. So let's look at our 2 different options. If I'm a parallelogram and I have one diagonal that bisects the angles, would I be a rectangle or a rhombus? One diagonal bisects the angles. Rhombus, because that's a rhombus property. Okay, if I'm a parallelogram and I've got one right angle. Rectangle, because that's a rectangle property. Very good. If I'm a parallelogram and I have perpendicular diagonals, what am I? Rhombus. Very good. If I'm a parallelogram and I've got one pair of congruent consecutive sides, it's kind of another way of saying all sides are congruent, so that's a rhombus. His opposite sides are congruent, but also his consecutive sides are congruent. And then the congruent diagonals is obviously a rectangle. Okay, here's your homework answers. Yesterday's homework was called Special Parallelograms 1. If a parallelogram is a rhombus, it's supposed to have 4 congruent sides, it's supposed to have perpendicular diagonals, and it's supposed to have diagonals that bisect the angles. That slide that I was dragging and dropping things, that was just to practice. You didn't need to write that down. We were just using our properties to answer that. What you had to write down, what was important, was the properties. Okay. We're going to go through 7, we're going to go over 7 through 11 for sure in the slides today. Do you want me to go over any of the true-false? I'll just go over the true-false, okay? So in the true-false, we've got no rectangles are rhombi. So we went over that a little bit yesterday. A rectangle is not a rhombus unless a rectangle is a square. If a rectangle gets promoted to a square, then it is a rhombus. So if I say no rectangle or rhombi, no rectangles or rhombi, that's false. Because a rectangle can be a rhombus if a rectangle is a square. If a rectangle is a square, then it's a rhombus. Number 6, all parallelograms with 4 congruent sides have 4 congruent angles. All parallelograms with 4 congruent sides have 4 congruent angles. So here's a rhombus, and it's got 4 congruent sides, but this angle is acute, and this angle is obtuse. It doesn't work like a triangle. In a triangle, if you've got 3 congruent sides, you've got 3 congruent angles. But that's not how it works in a parallelogram, in a quadrilateral. Okay? So in a rhombus, we've got 4 congruent sides, but we don't have 4 congruent angles. We've got opposite angles, those are still congruent, but not 4 congruent sides. Okay, angles. I want you to look at these shapes and decide which ones are parallelograms. Some of them are, and some of them are not parallelograms. You don't have enough information. A is not a parallelogram because I don't know what this angle is and I don't know what this angle is. I don't have enough information. G is not a parallelogram. It's a kite. Very good. F is not a parallelogram because I don't know those 2 angles. One more, guys. You left one out. D is not a parallelogram because I only have 1 pair of opposite sides parallel. Yes. So for each one, like number 1, that's a parallelogram. Is it a rectangle, rhombus, or just a parallelogram? Number 2, is it A, B, or C? Number 3, A, B, or C? Okay, number 1, if you're a parallelogram and you've got 1 right angle, that means you have all right angles. So number 1 is A. Number 1 is a rectangle. If it has 1 right angle, they all have to be right angles because opposite angles are congruent and consecutive angles are supplementary. Number 2, you're a parallelogram and the diagonals are bisecting the angles. So that means it is